Elderly man is kicked out of a luxury store in Beverly Hills, but when the owner arrives and recognizes him, everyone is shocked. George Anderson closed the door to his modest home, shrugging his worn denim jacket into place over his broad shoulders. Inside, the house was a living museum of his life. The walls bore testament to decades of memories, captured in black and white photographs of his younger self, a soldier standing among comrades, the weight of war evident in their faces. Interspersed were vibrant color photos of Margaret, his late wife, her smile radiant and full of life, and Judy, their daughter, frozen in time as a child, now grown and the mother of his granddaughter Sarah. George's gaze settled on one particular photo, its frame slightly tarnished but lovingly polished. Sarah, smiling brightly, her eyes alive with the same warmth that once belonged to Margaret. Sarah was getting married soon. The thought stirred something deep within George, a blend of pride and nostalgia. He wanted to be there for her, not just as her grandfather, but as someone she could be proud of. The decision had been made. He would buy a new suit. It wasn't a simple purchase to George. A new suit wasn't just about looking sharp. It was a way of honoring Sarah's special day. She reminded him so much of Margaret, the same gentleness in her eyes, the quiet grace in her movements. He wanted to reflect that joy, even if his own past was filled with scars and shadows. Without telling anyone, George decided to take the bus into Beverly Hills. He'd heard about Prestige Couture, a high-end boutique on Rodeo Drive. It was renowned for its impeccable suits, and while George didn't care for luxury, he wanted the best for Sarah's wedding. He also knew his faded jeans, scuffed boots, and old jacket wouldn't go unnoticed in such a place. But George had lived long enough to understand that judgment often came from those who looked but didn't see. The moment he stepped into Prestige Couture, the difference between his world and this one hit him like a wave. Chandeliers of sparkling crystal hung overhead, casting light onto the polished marble floors. Mannequins stood like statues, draped in suits that looked more like works of art than clothing. Everything in the store exuded wealth and sophistication. George, in his humble attire, was a stark contrast to the space around him. He walked in quietly, his boots clicking softly against the floor, but his presence drew the attention of Victoria Hughes. She was tall, impeccably dressed, with sharp eyes that scanned him from head to toe. Her smile was polite, but it didn't reach her eyes. "May I help you?" Victoria asked, her voice laced with a subtle sarcasm that George didn't catch at first. "Yes, ma'am," George said with genuine warmth. "I'm looking for a suit. My granddaughter is getting married, and I want to look my best." Victoria's eyes flicked to Daniel Piper, the younger sales associate standing near the back of the store. His nervous glance at George betrayed his discomfort. "Perhaps," Victoria said, her words deliberate, "you'd find something more suitable elsewhere." Daniel shifted uneasily. "Victoria, maybe we could." "Daniel," Victoria interrupted, her tone sharp but quiet, "our clientele expects a certain standard." She smiled thinly at George. George felt the sting of her words, though he masked it with the calm dignity he'd cultivated over a lifetime. "I assure you," he said softly, "I can pay for what I need." Victoria's smile grew tighter, her posture unwavering. "I'm certain of that. But I believe we may not have what you're looking for." Daniel stepped forward, a spark of defiance in his otherwise timid demeanor. "Mr. Anderson, right? I'd be happy to." "Daniel," Victoria snapped, cutting him off. Her gaze alone was enough to silence him. George nodded slowly, the weight of humiliation settling on him. He turned toward the door, his boots again striking the marble floor. The chime above the door rang out as he exited, and for a moment, the world outside seemed quieter, heavier. Standing at the bus stop, George leaned against the metal pole, his hands resting on his cane. Memories began to surface, unbidden. He saw the flickering glow of flames against the night sky, felt the heat against his skin, and heard the desperate cries of a child. It had been decades ago, but the scene remained vivid. A house engulfed in fire, smoke so thick it choked the air. He had rushed in without hesitation, breaking through the blaze to find a young boy trapped in a bedroom. "Don't worry," George had said all those years ago, his voice steady despite the chaos. "I've got you." The boy's tear-streaked face blurred in his memory, but the gratitude in his eyes remained crystal clear. George had never sought recognition for his actions that night. He wasn't a man who needed medals or applause. But the image of that boy's relief, his safety, was something George carried with him always. As the bus approached, its brakes hissing softly, George straightened up. His thoughts lingered on the past even as he stepped aboard. Shadows of old battles, both on the field and within himself, followed him as he took his seat, staring out at the city passing by. Little did George know his actions that night, the boy he had saved, were tied to the life he was about to cross paths with once again. David Roberts strode into prestige couture, his polished leather shoes clicking against the pristine marble floor. His tailored suit, perfectly cut to his tall frame, exuded authority. David wasn't just any businessman. He was the man behind Prestige Couture, a self-made mogul who built the boutique into a symbol of luxury. Despite his success, David carried himself with a calm confidence, rarely showing frustration or impatience. "Victoria," he greeted the senior sales associate as he approached the front counter. "How are sales today?" His voice was casual, but carried an undercurrent of expectation. Victoria straightened, her professional smile widening. "Excellent, as always, Mr. Roberts," she replied smoothly. Then, with a flicker of amusement in her tone, she added, "We did have an unusual visitor earlier." David's brows furrowed slightly. "Unusual how?" "A man," Victoria said, her smile growing more condescending. "Older. Not exactly our target clientele." She let out a small laugh, clearly finding humor in the situation. "He wanted to buy a suit, but well, what?" David asked, his voice sharpening. Victoria hesitated for a split second, but maintained her composure. He didn't seem like the type who would actually make a purchase. "I suggested he might find something more appropriate elsewhere." Daniel Piper, the junior associate, was standing a few steps away, shifting uncomfortably. David caught the subtle movement and turned his attention to the young man. "Daniel, is that how it happened?" Daniel hesitated, glancing nervously at Victoria before meeting David's eyes. He was looking for a suit for his granddaughter's wedding," Daniel said quietly. "I thought we could show him a few options, but Victoria decided he wasn't worth the time," David finished, his tone now laced with disappointment. Victoria bristled. "I was ensuring we maintained the store's image," she defended. "Our brand is about exclusivity, Mr. Roberts." "People like that." "People like that?" David interrupted, his voice cold. "What does that even mean?" Victoria faltered. "I just meant he didn't seem appropriate for our clientele." David's jaw tightened. He didn't say anything more, but his silence was more pointed than words. He turned to the security monitor behind the counter. "Show me the footage," he said. Victoria glanced at him, confused. "The footage?" "Yes," David said firmly. "I want to see this man you deemed unworthy of our time." Daniel hurried to pull up the recordings. As the video began to play, David leaned in, watching intently. The moment George Anderson appeared on the screen, David froze. He barely registered the worn denim jacket or the scuffed boots. His attention was fixed on George's face, his piercing blue eyes and calm, weathered expression. Those eyes. That face. It was unmistakable. David's mind reeled, the polished facade he carried cracking under the weight of memory. He was 8 years old again, trapped in his burning home. Smoke had choked his lungs, flames licked the walls, and he'd thought it was the end. Then, through the chaos, a man had burst through the fire, his strong arms pulling David to safety. David whispered, almost to himself, "It can't be Mr. Roberts." Victoria asked, puzzled by his reaction. David didn't answer. His heart raced as he rewound the footage and played it again, needing to be sure. The more he watched, the clearer it became. It was him. The man who had saved his life. Without another word, David grabbed his coat and headed for the door. "Mr. Roberts, where are you going?" Victoria called after him, confused. "To fix a mistake," David said sharply, not looking back. Michael Bennett, David's business partner, stepped out of his office as David passed. "What's going on?" he asked, but David didn't stop to explain. Michael turned to Victoria, who merely shrugged, still baffled. David didn't stop moving until he reached the street. He scanned the area, his heart pounding as he searched for George. His eyes landed on a familiar figure at the bus stop a block away. Without hesitation, he broke into a jog. "Sir," he called out, his voice carrying over the sound of traffic. "Wait, please." George turned, startled. His eyes met David's, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "Do I know you?" George asked cautiously, his voice steady despite his surprise. David approached, his chest heaving slightly from the sudden exertion. "You saved my life," he said, emotion thick in his voice. "Years ago. A fire. You pulled me out." George stared at him, his mind searching the past. Recognition slowly dawned in his eyes. The boy from the fire. David nodded, unable to suppress the overwhelming gratitude that filled him. "Yes. That was me." George's face softened, though his expression remained reserved. "That was a long time ago," he said quietly. David's voice was steady but insistent. "Please, come back to the store with me. Let me make this right. You didn't deserve to be treated the way you were." George hesitated, his eyes scanning David's face. There was no doubt in his mind that the younger man was sincere, but years of humility had made George wary of grand gestures. "I don't want to cause any trouble," he said. "You're not causing trouble," David replied earnestly. "You're helping me fix one." For a long moment, George studied him. Then, with a slight nod, he agreed. "All right." David smiled, relief washing over him. "Thank you." As the two men began walking back to Prestige Couture, neither of them spoke. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that held unspoken understanding, a connection forged long before either of them knew the other's name. When David stepped back into Prestige Couture with George beside him, the store's ambience shifted dramatically. The usual hum of quiet conversations and soft footsteps on the marble floor disappeared as the staff turned their attention to the unlikely pair. George, still clad in his worn denim jacket and scuffed boots, stood out against the boutique's opulent decor. Victoria Hughes froze mid-conversation with another client, her polished composure faltering. Her eyes widened slightly as she processed what she was seeing. Michael Bennett, observing from a distance, raised an eyebrow, his expression tinged with amused curiosity. David stopped just inside the entrance and surveyed the room. His sharp eyes landed on Victoria, who instinctively straightened her posture. "I have an announcement," David said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. There was no anger in his tone, but the weight of his words commanded attention. Victoria's unease was evident, though she masked it with a thin smile. Michael, on the other hand, leaned back against the counter, his arms crossed, waiting to see where this would go. David gestured to George, standing beside him. "This man saved my life when I was a child. He is a hero. And today, he was treated in a manner that is not only disrespectful but completely unacceptable." The gravity of his statement hung in the air, and all eyes shifted to George, who looked uncomfortable under the sudden spotlight. Victoria's professional demeanor cracked further. "Mr. Roberts," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "if I may." "No, you may not," David interrupted, his tone firm. He wasn't yelling, but the authority in his voice silenced her immediately. "There is no justification for what happened here today. None." Victoria's cheeks flushed red, her lips parting as if to argue, but she quickly thought better of it. "And you," David continued, turning his gaze to Michael. "This mentality, this sense of superiority, has no place here. It's toxic, and it goes against everything this business should stand for." Michael scoffed, his arms still crossed. "David, you're letting your emotions cloud your judgment. This is about business, about image. That man," he said, nodding toward George, "doesn't represent our clientele. You know that as well as I do." David didn't flinch. "And what image is that, Michael? An image built on arrogance? Prejudice? Dismissing people based on their appearance? If that's the image you want to uphold, then we have a bigger problem than I thought." Michael straightened, his expression hardening. "We built this company on exclusivity, David. That's what our clients expect. You start pandering to sentimentality, and you'll see how quickly that reputation crumbles." David stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "I'd rather lose every so-called exclusive client than run a business that lacks basic decency. If that's a problem for you, Michael, then maybe it's time we re-evaluate this partnership." The room fell silent again. Michael's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his frustration evident. Victoria, visibly shaken, took a step toward George. "Mr. Anderson," she said quietly, her voice now stripped of its earlier haughtiness. I apologize for how I treated you. I misjudged you, and I was wrong." George looked at her, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he nodded slightly. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice calm. David turned to Daniel, who had been watching the scene unfold from behind the counter, looking both nervous and relieved. "Daniel," David said, "help Mr. Anderson find a suit. The best we have. And it's on the house." Daniel's face lit up with a mix of gratitude and excitement. "Of course, Mr. Roberts. Right away." He approached George with a warm smile. "Mr. Anderson, if you'll follow me, I'll show you some options." George hesitated, glancing at David. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "I want to," David replied, his voice softening. "It's the least I can do." George nodded again, allowing Daniel to lead him further into the store. As the evening went on, David personally assisted George, ensuring every detail of the fitting was perfect. George was hesitant at first, but David's genuine kindness slowly put him at ease. "This reminds me of my wife," George said at one point, running his hand over the fine fabric of a navy blue suit. "She always wanted me to dress sharp. Never thought I'd be wearing something like this, though." David smiled. "She had good taste, then. And I'm sure she'd be proud of how you'll look at your granddaughter's wedding." George's face softened at the mention of Sarah. "She's the best part of my life," he said quietly. "All I want is to make her proud." "You've already done that," David said firmly. By the time the fitting was complete, George was dressed in a suit that fit him perfectly. David stood back, admiring the transformation. "You look incredible," David said with a smile. George glanced at himself in the mirror, his reflection unfamiliar yet comforting. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. As they walked to the door, David handed George a carefully wrapped package containing the suit. "This is my gift to you," he said. George hesitated, clearly overwhelmed. "I don't know how to thank you," he murmured. "You already have," David replied. As George stepped out of the store, the bell above the door chimed softly. The air outside was quieter, almost serene. George paused for a moment, holding the suit close to his chest, before continuing down the street. Inside the store, David turned to Victoria and Michael, his expression serious. "Things are going to change around here," he said. "Starting now." That night, George Anderson lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The room was dark, save for the faint light from a street lamp outside. The suit from Prestige Couture hung neatly on the back of his bedroom door, a stark reminder of the day's events. It should have been a symbol of triumph, of kindness shown after an insult. But George couldn't shake the unease creeping over him. He closed his eyes, hoping for sleep to take him, but as soon as his mind drifted, the past surged forward like a flood he couldn't hold back. In his dream, the sounds of the jungle returned first, the hum of insects, the distant rustle of leaves, the heavy thud of boots on damp earth. He was back in Vietnam, the air thick with tension. The smell of mud, sweat, and smoke filled his nostrils. "Stay alert," his commanding officer whispered, the voice barely audible over the faint crackle of the radio at his hip. George gripped his rifle tightly, his knuckles white. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound a potential threat. The squad moved cautiously through the dense underbrush, their breaths shallow and controlled. George's heart pounded in his chest, loud enough that he feared it would betray their position. Then, without warning, the night erupted into chaos. "Ambush!" someone shouted, the word drowned out by the staccato of gunfire. George dropped to the ground, his instincts taking over. Bullets tore through the jungle, snapping branches and kicking up dirt. The muzzle flashes illuminated the terror on his comrades' faces. "Cover fire!" another voice yelled. George scrambled to his knees, raising his rifle and firing blindly into the darkness. The sharp metallic scent of blood mixed with the acrid smell of gunpowder. "Man down!" The cry came from his left. George turned and saw a soldier, barely out of his teens, lying in the dirt, clutching his side. Blood seeped through his uniform, pooling beneath him. George didn't hesitate. He crawled through the chaos, ignoring the bullets whizzing past his head. "Hold on," he shouted as he reached the soldier. "I've got you." He slung the young man's arm over his shoulder and began to drag him back toward cover. The weight was unbearable, but George pushed through it, gritting his teeth. A deafening explosion rocked the ground, throwing George off his feet. He landed hard, his ears ringing and his vision blurred. When he opened his eyes, the soldier he had been trying to save was gone, his body replaced by a smoking crater. "No!" George screamed, scrambling forward on his hands and knees. His fingers dug into the dirt, searching for any sign of the boy, but there was nothing. The jungle around him seemed to close in, the shadows growing darker and more menacing. Faces appeared in the trees, his fallen comrades, their eyes accusing. "You left us," one of them said, his voice cold and hollow. "I didn't," George shouted, his voice breaking. "I tried to save you." "You left us," the voices repeated, growing louder and more insistent. "I did what I could," George cried, his hands shaking. "I didn't want." The jungle dissolved, the trees melting into smoke. George found himself standing in the middle of a burning village. The flames roared around him, consuming everything in their path. The cries of women and children echoed in his ears. "Why didn't you stop it?" a child's voice asked. George turned and saw a boy standing in the flames, his face expressionless. "I couldn't," George stammered, his throat dry. "It wasn't my choice." The boy stepped closer, his eyes reflecting the fire. "You let it happen." "I didn't want to," George whispered, tears streaming down his face. The boy raised a hand, pointing directly at George. "You let it happen." George woke with a start, his body jerking upright in bed. His heart pounded against his ribcage, and his shirt was soaked with sweat. He gasped for air, his hands clutching the blanket as if it were the only thing anchoring him to reality. For several moments, he sat in the darkness, his breath ragged and his body trembling. The nightmare had been so vivid, so real, that he could still hear the gunfire and smell the smoke. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and buried his face in his hands. "It's just a dream," he muttered to himself, his voice shaking. Just a dream. But he knew it wasn't. The dream wasn't merely a fabrication of his mind. It was a memory, a warped and twisted version of events that had haunted him for decades. George stood, his legs unsteady, and made his way to the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water, his hands shaking so badly that a few drops spilled onto the counter. He drank it in one long gulp, hoping to calm his nerves. As he stood there in the dimly lit kitchen, the silence of his home felt oppressive. The events at Prestige Couture had stirred something inside him, something he had spent years trying to suppress. Seeing David, the boy he had saved from the fire, had brought it all rushing back. The choices he had made, the lives he had taken, and the lives he couldn't save. He placed the empty glass on the counter and leaned heavily against it, his head bowed. "What am I supposed to do now?" he murmured, the question hanging in the air. Deep down, George felt a growing sense of unease. It wasn't just the memories that troubled him, it was the feeling that his past was no longer content to stay buried. Something was coming, and George wasn't sure he was ready to face it. He glanced at the suit hanging on the door of his bedroom, a stark contrast to the life he had lived. It was a reminder of the kindness he had been shown, but also a symbol of the man he had tried to become, a man who could leave the shadows of his past behind. But as he returned to bed, sleep did not come. The voices from his dream echoed in his mind, relentless and accusing. "You left us." Michael Bennett sat in his dimly lit office at Prestige Couture, his fingers drumming against the sleek surface of his desk. The events of the past few days gnawed at him, a bitter resentment festering in his mind. David had humiliated him, publicly undermining his authority, dismissing his concerns about the boutique's image, and choosing sentiment over sound business judgment. It wasn't just anger driving Michael now. It was pride. He had built this business with David from the ground up, and he wasn't about to let his partner jeopardize their success over a misplaced sense of morality. But the key to regaining control wasn't simply to argue or negotiate, it was leverage. And leverage required information. Michael leaned back in his chair, the glow of his computer screen reflecting in his cold, calculating eyes. He had noticed the connection between George Anderson and David, the way David had defended the old man, the personal nature of his gratitude. There was something deeper there, something Michael didn't understand but knew he could exploit. He began his search late that night, typing George Anderson into a background check database he had access to through one of his less-than-legitimate contacts. At first, the results were mundane, a war veteran living a modest life, widowed, with a daughter and granddaughter. Nothing unusual. "Come on," Michael muttered, clicking through the records impatiently. "There's got to be something." It wasn't until he dug further into George's military history that he found the threads of a story. George Anderson wasn't just any veteran. His name appeared in declassified documents tied to the Vietnam War, specifically to covert operations. The kind of missions the government didn't talk about. The kind of missions that left no heroes, only survivors. Michael's interest peaked. He pulled up more documents, piecing together fragments of reports and testimonies. George's unit had been involved in reconnaissance and target neutralization. The records were vague, but the implications were clear. These were missions where morality blurred, where survival often meant making choices that could haunt a man for the rest of his life. One report stood out. It detailed an operation in a small village, an operation that ended in disaster. Civilian casualties. Accusations of overreach. George's name wasn't explicitly mentioned, but Michael found enough hints to tie him to the incident. "Bingo," Michael whispered, leaning closer to the screen. The pieces began to fit together in his mind. If George had a past worth hiding, it would make him vulnerable. And if David was emotionally invested in protecting George, then exposing that past could weaken David's position and give Michael the upper hand. The next step was clear. Michael needed more than just circumstantial evidence. He needed proof. The following morning, Michael made a call to one of his contacts, a man named Harris who specialized in digging up dirt for the right price. Harris wasn't interested in the morality of his work, only in getting paid. "Michael Bennett," Harris said smoothly when he answered the call. "It's been a while. What can I do for you?" "I need everything you can find on a man named George Anderson," Michael replied. "He's a Vietnam veteran. There's something buried in his past, and I want it unearthed." Harris chuckled. "You know these old war stories are messy. Could take some time." "I'm not interested in excuses," Michael said coldly. "I'm interested in results. Money's not an issue. Just find me something I can use." Harris agreed, and within hours, the investigation was underway. Michael spent the day pacing his office, waiting for updates. He ignored David's attempts to discuss upcoming business plans and avoided Victoria, whose sudden change in demeanor since the incident with George irritated him further. By evening, Harris called back with a lead. "You're not going to believe this," Harris said. "The guy's name is tied to a village operation that went sideways during the war. Real ugly stuff, civilians caught in the crossfire, political fallout, the whole 9 yards. And get this, there's still someone alive who remembers it." Michael's interest sharpened. "Who?" "A woman. She was a child at the time, one of the survivors. Her name's Tween Gwyn. Lives in Los Angeles now, if you can believe that. She's kept quiet about what happened, but her name shows up in some old interviews and records." Michael smiled for the first time that day. "Send me everything you have." That night, Michael pored over the new information, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The more he read, the clearer it became that George's past wasn't just a liability for him, it was a weapon Michael could wield. But something about the story nagged at the back of Michael's mind. The details of the operation, the survivors' accounts, they painted a picture of a man caught in impossible circumstances. A man who had been forced to make devastating choices. For a moment, Michael hesitated. Was he going too far? Was this level of manipulation justified? He quickly brushed the thought aside. "This is business," he told himself. "Nothing personal." Michael's plan was almost ready. He would reach out to Tween Gwyn, gain her trust, and persuade her to come forward with her story. Once the media caught wind of George's involvement, it wouldn't just tarnish the old man's reputation, it would force David to question everything he thought he knew about the man he had called a hero. Michael leaned back in his chair, satisfied. He had the leverage he needed. All that was left was to set the plan in motion. Michael Bennett sat hunched over his desk, a dim light casting long shadows across the room. The air was thick with the tension of his obsession, his computer screen glowing as he pored over file after file. For days, he had immersed himself in uncovering George Anderson's secrets, driven by a potent mix of spite and ambition. He couldn't shake the sting of his humiliation at Prestige Couture and the growing divide between himself and David Roberts. If he couldn't restore his control over the boutique by persuasion, he'd do it through power, and George was the key. The documents Harris had unearthed were scattered across the desk, some bearing faded military seals, others marked with ominous, declassified stamps. Michael's fingers moved with precision, flipping through each page, scanning for the details he needed to craft his narrative. The deeper he dug, the more tangled George's story became. A pattern began to emerge. George wasn't just a foot soldier in Vietnam. He was part of a specialized unit tasked with covert operations. The missions were shadowy, involving reconnaissance, infiltration, and occasionally, neutralization. The reports were littered with euphemisms that barely concealed the grim realities of war. Michael paused at one particular file, his eyes narrowing. It described an operation coded Black Harvest. The mission was intended to disrupt enemy supply lines in a remote village, but something had gone catastrophically wrong. Civilians had been caught in the crossfire, and the operation ended in tragedy. George's name appeared alongside a short list of operatives involved. The official report described it as a necessary loss, but hinted at internal disagreements among the team. Michael leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The pieces fit too perfectly. George had spent decades living a quiet, modest life, but it was clear now that he carried a past steeped in moral compromise. "This is it," Michael muttered to himself, his lips curling into a smug grin. The phone on his desk buzzed, breaking his concentration. He picked it up, recognizing Harris's number. "What do you have for me?" Michael asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "I've got the last piece of your puzzle," Harris replied smoothly. "Turns out, Black Harvest had survivors. And one of them, Tween Gwyn, is still around. She's been living here in LA for years. Quiet life, works as a seamstress. But here's the kicker, she's spoken about the incident before, in interviews with veterans advocacy groups. She blames the Americans for what happened to her family." Michael sat up straighter, his interest piqued. "Does she know George by name?" "Not explicitly," Harris said, "but the unit's records place him there. If you push her in the right direction, she might connect the dots." Michael's grin widened. "Good work. Send me her contact information." The next morning, Michael made his move. He arrived at a small, unassuming seamstress shop on the outskirts of the city. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, his eyes scanning the space. Bolts of fabric lined the walls, and a sewing machine hummed softly in the back. A petite woman in her early 60s turned to greet him. Her dark eyes were sharp, framed by lines that spoke of a life marked by hardship and resilience. "May I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but wary. Michael stepped forward, his demeanor carefully calculated. "Ms. Gwyn, my name is Michael Bennett. I'm here about something important, something from the past." Her expression darkened slightly, but she remained composed. "I don't usually talk about the past, Mr. Bennett. What is this about?" Michael hesitated for effect, lowering his voice as though he carried a great burden. "I've been researching the events in your village during the war. The Operation Black Harvest." Her reaction was immediate. The color drained from her face, and her hands clenched the fabric she had been working on. "Why are you bringing this up now?" "Because the truth matters," Michael said, feigning sincerity. "I believe the man who was partly responsible for what happened to you is living here in Los Angeles. His name is George Anderson." She stared at him, her expression unreadable. "And why would you tell me this? What do you expect me to do with it?" "I believe you deserve justice," Michael said, leaning closer. "You've lived in silence for too long. If you're willing to share your story, if you're willing to name names, it could bring closure to others who suffered as you did." Twee's hands trembled slightly, but she set her jaw. "Closure," she repeated bitterly. "What closure can there be for a child who lost her family?" Michael remained quiet, letting the weight of her words fill the air. He knew he had her attention. "Think about it," he said gently. "If people knew the truth about what happened, it might prevent something like this from ever happening again." Twee glanced away, her mind clearly racing. "I'll need time to think," she said finally. Michael nodded, knowing he had planted the seed. "Take all the time you need. But when you're ready, here's how to reach me." He handed her a card and left the shop, a satisfied smirk on his face. Back in his office that evening, Michael reviewed the dossier one more time. It was damning. The combination of official records, survivor testimony, and the media's inevitable hunger for a story would destroy George's reputation, and by extension, David's unwavering trust in him. Michael poured himself a glass of whiskey, raising it in a mock toast to the folder spread out before him. "To redemption," he said, his tone dripping with irony. As the night wore on, Michael finalized his plans. He would give Tween Gwyn the time she needed to decide, but he wasn't going to wait passively. He began drafting anonymous tips to reporters, laying the groundwork for a media storm that would sweep up George Anderson and everything connected to him. For Michael, this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about power. George Anderson spent his days quietly preparing for Sarah's upcoming wedding. The suit David had gifted him hung neatly in his closet, ready for the big day. Every time George looked at it, he felt a strange mixture of pride and unease. Pride, because Sarah deserved his very best on her special day. Unease, because something about the events at Prestige Couture had unsettled him. The memories stirred by his interaction with David, The boy he'd saved so many years ago had unlocked a door in George's mind that he'd kept shut for decades. The jungle, the missions, the faces of men he couldn't save, they were always there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the quiet moments to reappear. Despite the weight of those memories, George focused on the joy of Sarah's wedding. He spent hours reminiscing about Margaret, his late wife, imagining how proud she would have been to see their granddaughter so grown, so full of life. But as the days passed, George noticed something strange. Late at night, his phone began to ring. The first time, he answered groggily, expecting it to be Judy or Sarah with a question about the wedding arrangements. Instead, there was silence. A long, heavy silence, broken only by the faint sound of breathing on the other end. "Hello," George said again, his voice sharp. But the caller hung up. The second call came the following night. This time, George was more alert. He sat up in bed, gripping the phone tightly as he answered. "Who is this?" he demanded. Again, silence. Then, the same slow, deliberate breathing. "Whoever this is, you'd better speak up or stop calling," George growled. The line went dead. By the time the third call came, George's patience had worn thin. It was late, and he had just settled into his armchair with a book when the phone rang. His heart sank as he reached for it, already dreading what he'd hear. "Who the hell is this?" George snapped, his voice firm. For a moment, there was nothing but that same unnerving breathing. Then finally, a man's voice spoke, low and deliberate. "You know what you did." The words hit George like a blow to the chest. His grip on the phone tightened as his knuckles turned white. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice quieter now, though no less intense. "You heard me," the voice replied. "You know what you did." George's breath caught. For a moment, he felt as though he'd been transported back in time, to a humid jungle filled with the sounds of gunfire and screams. "Who are you?" he demanded, though his voice betrayed a tremor he couldn't suppress. The caller didn't answer. The line clicked, and the silence that followed was deafening. George set the phone down slowly, his mind racing. He had spent years burying the ghosts of his past, but now they seemed determined to claw their way to the surface. The words of the caller repeated in his mind like a drumbeat. "You know what you did." He stood and began pacing the room, his thoughts spiraling. Had it been a mistake to intervene at Prestige Couture? Had his actions drawn unwanted attention to him? Or was this something deeper? Someone who knew the truth about his time in Vietnam? He thought back to the missions, the ones that haunted him the most. The faces of the villagers, the sound of their cries, the orders he had followed despite the knot in his stomach. George had told himself for years that he'd had no choice, that he'd been a soldier following commands. But the guilt had never left him. Now, it seemed, neither had the consequences. The next morning, George tried to shake off the unease. He busied himself with wedding details, calling Judy to confirm times and double-checking the suit one more time. But the calls lingered in his mind, a constant undercurrent of tension that he couldn't ignore. That afternoon, as he stepped out to pick up a small gift for Sarah, he caught sight of a car parked just down the street. It was an old sedan, nondescript, with dark-tinted windows. Something about it felt off. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, squinting at the vehicle. The car didn't move. Shaking his head, George muttered to himself, "You're getting paranoid, old man." But as he turned to walk away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. By the time evening came, George was more restless than ever. He sat in his armchair, staring at the phone, half expecting it to ring again. The hours passed slowly, the silence of the house pressing down on him. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He stood and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain to peer outside. The street was quiet, but his eyes darted to the spot where the sedan had been earlier. It was gone. Maybe it's nothing, he told himself. But deep down, he knew better. George returned to his chair, rubbing his temples as he tried to calm his racing mind. He thought about calling David or Judy, but what would he say? That some anonymous caller had rattled him? That he was seeing shadows where there might be none? No. He couldn't drag them into this, not without knowing more. For now, George resolved to wait. But the nagging feeling in his chest told him that this was just the beginning. David Roberts had always prided himself on his ability to read people. In business, it was a skill that had served him well. But with George Anderson, it wasn't just intuition, it was concern. Something had changed since the day George walked into Prestige Couture. The older man had been warm and straightforward then, But now, David sensed a distance in him. He tried to brush it off at first. Maybe it was the wedding stress, or perhaps George was just a private man. But as the days passed, David couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was wrong. The thought stayed with him until he decided to act on it. On a quiet afternoon, David found himself parked outside George's modest home. He stepped out of his car, smoothing his jacket as he approached the door. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure if he was overstepping. But then he thought about the way George had stood by him at the store, the man's humility and courage evident in every word he'd spoken. David owed him this. He knocked firmly on the door. After a moment it opened, revealing George standing there, his denim jacket slung over his broad shoulders. His expression was neutral, but there was a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "David," George said, his voice calm but guarded. "What brings you here?" David smiled, trying to lighten the mood. "I was in the neighborhood," he said, though it was a weak attempt. "And I wanted to check on you. Is everything all right?" George stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in," he said, his tone polite. David entered, glancing around the living room. The space was as unassuming as the man who lived in it. Simple furniture, a few framed photographs, and the suit from Prestige Couture still hanging neatly in the corner. George motioned for David to sit, but David remained standing. "George," he said, getting straight to the point, "I've noticed something. You've seemed different since that day at the store. Is everything okay?" George chuckled softly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You don't need to worry about me, David. I'm fine." David crossed his arms, unconvinced. "With all due respect, I don't believe you. You've been distant, distracted. And I get it, sometimes life throws things at us we don't want to deal with. But you don't have to handle it alone." George sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not something anyone else can help with," he said, his voice quiet. "It's nothing I haven't dealt with before. Does this have to do with your past?" David asked gently. George looked at him sharply, but before he could respond, the phone on the small table next to his chair began to ring. George's entire body tensed. David noticed it immediately, the way the older man's shoulders stiffened and his jaw clenched. "Are you going to answer that?" David asked, concerned. George hesitated, staring at the phone as if it were a coiled snake. Finally, he picked it up, his hand trembling slightly. "Hello," he said, his voice measured. There was a pause on the other end, and then a voice spoke, low and deliberate. "I hope you're ready, Anderson. The world's about to know who you really are." George froze, the color draining from his face. "Who is this?" he demanded, though his voice lacked the force he intended. But the caller didn't respond. The line went dead. George lowered the phone slowly, his hand still trembling as he placed it back on the receiver. David, who had been watching closely, stepped forward. "George," he said, his voice firm, "who was that? What's going on?" For a moment, George didn't answer. He stared at the phone as though expecting it to ring again. Finally, he turned to David, his expression weary. "Someone's digging," George said quietly. "Digging into things that should have stayed buried a long time ago." David frowned. "What things?" "George, if someone's harassing you, we need to go to the police." "It's not that simple," George replied, shaking his head. "This isn't just about me. It's complicated." David wasn't satisfied with the answer. "You've been there for me, George. Let me be there for you. If someone is threatening you, we'll handle it together. But I need to know what's going on." George sighed heavily, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's from my time in the war," he admitted reluctantly. "There are things I've tried to forget. Things I've never talked about. But it seems like someone has decided they want to drag it all out into the open." David's eyes widened slightly. "The war? George, whatever happened back then, it's the past. You're not that man anymore." "That's easy to say," George said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "But the world doesn't always see it that way. And if what I think is happening is true, it's going to affect more than just me." David sat down now, leaning forward. "Tell me who's behind this. Maybe I can help." George hesitated again. He had always been a private man, and sharing the weight of his past wasn't something he did easily. But looking at David, he saw a man who genuinely cared, a man who had shown him kindness and respect when so many others hadn't. "I don't know yet," George admitted. "But they know enough to make me worry." David nodded slowly. "Then we'll find out. Whatever this is, You're not facing it alone. George gave him a faint smile, though the worry in his eyes remained. Thank you, David, he said softly. That means more than you know. As David left the house later that evening, he couldn't shake the feeling that George was holding back. But one thing was clear: whoever was targeting George wasn't going to stop, and David wasn't about to stand by and let it happen. Michael Bennett sat at a corner table in a dimly lit coffee shop, the weight of his leather briefcase resting heavily against his leg. Inside were the documents, pages of George Anderson's military history and fragments of information about the classified missions that had defined his past. Michael's heart thudded with a mix of anticipation and malice. He had arranged the meeting carefully, choosing a low-profile location away from prestige couture. Across from him sat Leo Grayson, the editor-in-chief of the Spotlight Chronicle, a small but notorious tabloid known for sensational stories and ruthless investigations. Leo, a wiry man with sharp features and an unrelenting hunger for scandal, drummed his fingers on the table as he eyed Michael with curiosity. So, Leo said, leaning back in his chair, you said you've got something big. Something explosive. Michael nodded, his expression calm but confident. This isn't just big, he replied, opening his briefcase and pulling out a neatly organized folder. This could ruin a man's life. A man who's been parading around as a hero. Leo's interest was piqued. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Go on. Michael slid the folder across the table. The man's name is George Anderson, a Vietnam veteran who's been living quietly for decades. To most people, he's just a harmless old man, a family man even. But beneath the surface, there's a story people need to hear. Leo opened the folder, his sharp eyes scanning the first few pages. The documents detailed George's involvement in covert operations during the war, highlighting missions labeled with ominous code names like Black Harvest. The more Leo read, the more his brow furrowed. Questionable deaths, civilian casualties, Leo muttered, flipping through the pages. This is heavy stuff. Michael nodded, watching Leo's reaction closely. That's only the beginning. He was part of missions that went off the books for a reason, operations that the government buried because they didn't want the public to know what really happened. And George Anderson? He was in the middle of it. Leo glanced up, his expression skeptical. Why now? Why bring this to me? Michael smirked, leaning back in his chair. Let's just say there are people out there who think George Anderson is a saint. They see him as a hero, someone to look up to. But they don't know the truth. And I think it's time the truth comes out. Leo closed the folder, tapping it lightly against the table. This is good, he admitted. But it's thin. These documents are intriguing, sure, but there's no smoking gun here. No direct evidence tying Anderson to these atrocities in a way that would hold up under scrutiny. Michael's smirk didn't falter. That's where your team comes in. You're good at digging, Leo. I've given you the foundation. All you have to do is follow the trail. Leo considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. It's risky, he said. If we run this and it blows up in our faces. It won't, Michael interrupted, his tone icy. There's more where that came from. Survivors. Witnesses. People who remember what happened. Leo raised an eyebrow. Survivors. A woman named Twing Gwyn, Michael said, lowering his voice. She was a child during one of Anderson's missions. Her family didn't survive, but she did. She's here in Los Angeles. If you can convince her to talk, you'll have your story. Leo's eyes gleamed with interest. You've done your homework. Michael leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. I want this story to hit hard. I want it everywhere. And I want it fast. Leo chuckled, closing the folder and slipping it into his bag. You've got yourself a deal. We'll dig into this and see what we can find. If it checks out, you'll get your scandal. And if it doesn't, it will, Michael said confidently, standing up. Keep me posted. As Michael left the coffee shop, he felt a surge of satisfaction. He could already imagine the headlines, hero or villain. The dark secrets of George Anderson. It wouldn't just destroy George's reputation, it would force David to rethink everything he believed about the man. And with David distracted, Michael could begin reclaiming his influence at Prestige Couture. He didn't care about the collateral damage. To Michael, George was just a pawn in a larger game, a means to an end. Back at the tabloid office, Leo wasted no time. He called his lead reporter, a brash young journalist named Carla Reese, and handed her the folder. This, Leo said, pointing to the documents, is your next big story. Find Twing Gwyn. Get her to talk. And don't stop digging until you've got enough to make this bulletproof. Carla flipped through the folder, her eyes widening as she skimmed the contents. This is heavy, she said. You sure about this? Leo grinned. The only thing better than a good story is a scandal. And this? This is gold. Meanwhile, Michael returned to his office at Prestige Couture, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. Victoria Hughes, who had been working on inventory nearby, noticed his unusual mood. Michael, she called, stepping closer. What's with the grin? Did you win the lottery or something? Better, Michael said, pouring himself a glass of whiskey from the bar in the corner. Let's just say things are finally going to go my way. Victoria raised an eyebrow. Care to share what that means? Michael sipped his drink, savoring the moment. Patience, Victoria. All in good time. George Anderson sat in his darkened living room, staring at the phone in his hand. The weight of the past few days bore down on him. The phone calls, the ominous voice, and the memories that had surfaced from the depths of his soul. He couldn't carry this burden alone anymore. It was time to face the truth, and more importantly, to share it with someone he trusted, someone who deserved to know. He dialed Judy's number with trembling fingers. The line rang twice before her voice came through, soft but laced with concern. Dad? Is everything okay? George hesitated for a moment. Hearing her voice was both a comfort and a reminder of why he had kept these secrets for so long. But now, there was no turning back. Judy, he said, his voice quiet but firm, I need to talk to you. Can I come over? Her worry deepened. What's wrong? You sound, I don't know, different. Are you all right? I just need to see you, George said, avoiding her question. It's important. Okay, she replied quickly. Come over. I'll make some tea. When George arrived at Judy's home, the porch light was already on, and she was waiting by the door. She opened it before he could knock, her face etched with concern. Dad, she said, stepping aside to let him in. You look tired. What's going on? George walked past her into the living room, his steps heavy. He glanced around the space, noting the framed photographs of Judy, Sarah, and their small family scattered on the walls and shelves. It was a warm, inviting home, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. Sit down, Judy urged, guiding him to the couch. She took a seat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. You're scaring me. Just tell me what's going on. George exhaled deeply, running a hand over his face. He felt the weight of decades pressing down on him. Judy, he began, his voice steady but low, there's something I've kept from you for a long time. Something I never wanted you to know. She tilted her head, her brow furrowed. What are you talking about? Is this about the wedding? Sarah. He shook his head. No, it's not about Sarah. It's about me. About the war. Judy blinked, caught off guard. The war? Dad, you never talk about that. You've always said it was too hard. It is hard, George admitted. But not for the reasons you think. It's not just the memories or the things I saw. It's the things I did. The choices I made. I've spent years trying to bury them, but they're coming back now. I can't escape them anymore. Judy's concern deepened, but she reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. Whatever it is, you can tell me. I'm here for you. George hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. During the war, I wasn't just a soldier. I was part of a unit that carried out missions. Missions that weren't talked about, even among other soldiers. Reconnaissance. Covert operations. Things that had to be done in the shadows. She squeezed his arm gently, encouraging him to continue. There was one mission, he said, his voice growing heavier. Black Harvest. We were sent to disrupt enemy supply lines in a village. We were told it was a staging ground for the Viet Cong, that it was critical to the war effort. But when we got there, it wasn't what they said it was. What do you mean? Judy asked, her voice soft. It wasn't a staging ground, George said, his hands trembling. It was a village. Families. Children. They weren't fighters, they were just trying to survive. But we didn't know that until it was too late. Judy's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God. I was following orders, George continued, his voice breaking. But that doesn't change what happened. Innocent people died, Judy. And I was there. I was part of it. Tears welled in Judy's eyes, but she didn't let go of his arm. You didn't know, she said gently. You thought you were doing the right thing. George shook his head, his eyes distant. I saw the fear in their faces. I heard their cries. And I still followed orders. I told myself I didn't have a choice, but the truth is, I made choices. Choices that I've had to live with every day since. Judy leaned closer, her voice trembling but firm. Dad, you've carried this alone for so long. But you're not that man anymore. You've spent your life taking care of me, of Sarah. You've shown us nothing but love and kindness. That's who you are. He looked at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. You don't hate me? Hate you, she said, her voice rising slightly in disbelief. You're my father. I could never hate you. You made mistakes, horrible ones, but you're still the man who raised me, the man who's always been there for me. That doesn't change. George closed his eyes, a tear slipping down his cheek. Thank you, he whispered. That means more than I can say. The two sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the confession settling between them. For the first time in decades, George felt a small sense of relief, like a burden he had carried alone was finally being shared. But the moment was shattered by the sharp ding of Judy's phone on the coffee table. She reached for it instinctively, her brow furrowing as she read the notification. Her face paled. Dad. What is it? George asked, his voice laced with concern. Judy turned the screen toward him. The headline blazed in bold letters. War veteran with a dark past exposed. The hidden truth about George Anderson. George stared at the words, his heart sinking. His hands clenched into fists as the reality of what he was seeing hit him. The secret he had fought so hard to keep buried was now out in the open, for the entire world to see. No, he whispered, his voice trembling. This can't be happening. Judy's eyes filled with tears as she looked at him. Dad, who did this? Who would do something like this? George shook his head slowly. I don't know, he said, though deep down, he had his suspicions. George Anderson sat in his armchair, his body frozen as if the weight of the phone in his trembling hand had pinned him there. The headline from the tabloid article seemed to scream at him from Judy's phone screen. The hero with bloodied hands, a past of war and secrets. The words weren't just letters on a page, they were daggers aimed directly at his chest. His face, weathered from years of burden, looked even more worn now, as though the words themselves had added another decade to his life. Beside him, Judy sat on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She watched her father's face as he stared at the phone, and it broke her heart. She had always known her father carried heavy memories, but seeing him like this, so vulnerable, was something new. This isn't fair, Dad, Judy said softly, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and sorrow. You don't deserve this. Who would do something like this? George exhaled a long, slow sigh, his shoulders slumping further. He finally set the phone down on the small table beside him, his hand hovering over it for a moment as if reluctant to let it go. Someone who either wants to destroy me, he said quietly, his voice low and steady, or someone who wants to hurt the people around me by using my past against me. Judy frowned, her brows knitting together. But why? What would they even gain from this? George shook his head. I don't know yet, he admitted. But whoever did this, they know what they're doing. They've waited a long time for this moment, and now they've put me in the spotlight for reasons I can't fully understand. Judy leaned forward, her voice rising with frustration. Well, they're cowards. Digging up your past like this and twisting it into something to shame you? It's disgusting. George reached out and placed a hand on hers, his touch gentle but firm. Judy, he said, meeting her gaze, I need you to stay strong for Sarah. She can't know about this. Not like this. The wedding is too close. This can't overshadow her happiness. Tears welled in Judy's eyes, but she nodded. I'll protect her, Dad. I promise. But we're going to figure out who did this, and we're going to fight back. George gave her a small, weary smile. Thank you, Judy. You don't know how much that means to me. Across town, David Roberts sat in his sleek office at Prestige Couture, his eyes scanning the same article on his computer screen. He felt a cold fury building in his chest. The man in the article wasn't the George Anderson he knew. The man he had come to respect wasn't the one being vilified in bold, lurid headlines. David's fists clenched as he read the words again. Former soldier exposed. A hero's legacy tainted by tragedy. He knew exactly who was behind this. He glanced at his office door, where he knew Michael Bennett was waiting in the lobby. David closed his laptop and rose from his desk, his movements sharp and deliberate. He pressed the intercom button on his phone. "Send him in," David said curtly. Moments later, Michael entered, his stride casual and confident. He wore his usual smirk, the kind that irritated David even in the best of circumstances. Today, it was unbearable. "David," Michael greeted, his tone dripping with mock politeness. "You wanted to see me?" David didn't waste time on pleasantries. He gestured toward the chair in front of his desk. "Sit." Michael's smirk widened as he took the seat, crossing his legs and leaning back like a man entirely in control. "What's this about?" Michael asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. David's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Of all the mistakes I've made in my career, Michael, keeping you as my partner has to be the worst." Michael chuckled, unfazed by the statement. "Is that so? And here I thought we made a pretty good team." David leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You think this is a game? That article, you had a hand in it, didn't you?" Michael didn't deny it. Instead, he leaned forward to meet David's glare. "I did what was necessary," he said, his tone cold and deliberate. "That man is no hero. And now everyone knows it." David rose from his seat, his voice rising slightly. "George Anderson is more of a man than you'll ever be, Michael. He's been through hell and come out the other side with more integrity than you could even comprehend. And you," David pointed an accusatory finger at Michael. "You've crossed the line. This isn't just business anymore. This is personal." Michael stood as well, his smirk returning. "You can moralize all you want, David, but the fact remains, the world knows the truth now. Your hero has been exposed for what he really is. A fraud." David's fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't take the bait. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice low and menacing. "You think this will make me back down? That it'll make me doubt George? You don't know me as well as you think you do, Michael. We're done. You and me, it's over." Michael raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "You can't get rid of me that easily, David. We built this company together. I know all your secrets. You think this ends well for you?" David's voice remained steady, though the anger behind it was unmistakable. "Maybe not. But at least I'll sleep at night, knowing I didn't betray someone who deserved better. You? You'll rot in the mess you've created." Michael's smirk faltered for the first time, but he quickly recovered, stepping closer to David. "You're making a mistake, David. You'll regret this." David met his gaze unflinchingly. "The only regret I have is not ending this partnership sooner." Michael scoffed, turning on his heel and walking toward the door. "We'll see who comes out on top," he said over his shoulder before disappearing into the hallway. David let out a breath, his hands pressing against the edge of his desk. He knew the fight was far from over, but he was more determined than ever to protect George from the storm that Michael had unleashed. George Anderson's world had grown smaller in the days following the tabloid's release. He avoided the windows of his home, pulling the curtains tightly shut as if they could shield him from the prying eyes of his neighbors. The phone rang incessantly, each call from an unknown number bringing with it a fresh wave of dread. He stopped answering altogether. The headlines were everywhere, the articles spreading like wildfire. His name, his face, and the darkest parts of his history were now public knowledge. Journalists gathered outside his house during the day, their cameras flashing whenever he dared peek out the front door. For the first time in years, George felt truly alone. The shame was suffocating. He replayed the accusations in his mind, each word cutting deeper than the last. He had spent decades trying to leave that version of himself behind, only to see it dragged into the light. Judy visited every day, bringing groceries or cooked meals in an attempt to keep her father's spirits up. She would sit with him at the kitchen table, talking about anything but the article. "Sarah's been busy with wedding plans," she said one afternoon, her voice light but forced. "She's got the flowers picked out. I think you're going to love them." George barely looked up from his cup of coffee, his hands wrapped tightly around it as if it was the only thing grounding him. "She shouldn't have to worry about me," he muttered. Judy reached across the table, touching his hand. "Dad, stop. This isn't your fault. Whoever did this, they're the ones to blame." George shook his head, his eyes clouded with regret. "I gave them the ammunition, Judy. My past, it's not something I can run from anymore. Maybe I deserve this." "You don't," Judy said firmly. "You made mistakes, But you're not that man anymore. Before George could respond, the sound of the front door opening broke the silence. Grandpa. Sarah's voice called out. George looked up as Sarah entered the kitchen, her face flushed with anger. She had a fierce determination in her eyes, one George recognized. It was the same fire Margaret used to have when she was fighting for something she believed in. Someone needs to be held accountable for this, Sarah said, her tone sharp. She crossed her arms, staring down at George. Who did this to you? George sighed, setting down his cup. It doesn't matter, sweetheart. What's done is done. Sarah's expression hardened. It matters to me. They don't get to drag your name through the mud and walk away like nothing happened. George gave her a sad smile. Fighting this won't change the past, Sarah. And it won't change what people think of me now. It's not just about what people think, Sarah snapped. It's about the truth. And about making sure whoever did this pays for it. Judy intervened, her voice calm but firm. Sarah, your grandfather's been through enough. Let's not push him. Sarah looked between them, her frustration evident. Fine, she said, her jaw tightening. If no one else is going to figure this out, I will. Later that day, Sarah drove straight to Prestige Couture, her anger driving her forward. She didn't stop to admire the polished storefront or the luxurious displays in the window. She marched inside, her heels clicking against the marble floor, and made a beeline for David's office. David was seated at his desk, his head buried in paperwork, when she burst through the door. He looked up startled, as Sarah closed the door behind her. Sarah, he said, rising to his feet. What are you doing here? Her eyes blazed. I need to know the truth, David. Who's behind that article about my grandfather? David hesitated, his expression falling. Sarah, Don't lie to me, she interrupted. You know something. I can see it on your face. David exhaled deeply, gesturing for her to sit. I didn't want you to get dragged into this, he said softly. I already am, Sarah shot back. That article has turned my grandfather's life upside down. He deserves to know who did this. David looked down at his desk for a long moment before meeting her gaze. It was Michael, he admitted, his voice laced with regret. He thought he could use your grandfather's past to hurt me, force me to back down in a disagreement we were having. I didn't know what he was planning until it was too late. Sarah's jaw clenched. You knew, and you didn't tell us? I didn't want to make things worse, David said quickly. I thought I could handle it. I thought I could stop him before it went this far. But I failed. That's not good enough, Sarah said, her voice sharp. Saying you're sorry doesn't undo what he's done. You have to fix this. David nodded, his shoulders slumping. You're right, he said quietly. I should have stopped him before this happened. But I promise you, Sarah, I'll make it right. Sarah didn't soften. She stood, her posture rigid. You'd better. Because if you don't, I will. David watched her leave, a mix of guilt and resolve in his expression. He knew he had to act quickly, not just for George, but for Sarah and Judy as well. David Roberts stood in the dimly lit warehouse, the air heavy with memories of the early days of Prestige Couture. This space had once been the birthplace of his vision, the rough beginnings of the luxury brand he had built with Michael Bennett. Now, years later, it felt symbolic to be back here, an ending to what had begun in this very room. Across the open floor, David's sharp eyes watched the door. Next to him stood Detective Lisa Perez, her stance professional and composed. She was an experienced officer, known for her unflinching ability to handle high-profile cases, and David had no doubt she was the right person for this confrontation. When the sound of footsteps echoed from the stairwell, David straightened. Moments later, Michael Bennett stepped into the warehouse, his usual smug confidence painted across his face. Well, Michael said, spreading his arms as he approached, this is dramatic, even for you, David. The old warehouse? What's next? A villain's monologue. David didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he gestured toward Lisa. Michael, I'd like you to meet Detective Lisa Perez. She has some questions for you. Michael paused mid-step, his smirk faltering slightly as his gaze shifted to Lisa. She stood with a folder tucked under her arm, her sharp, observant eyes locked on him. Detective, Michael said, regaining his composure. This feels a bit excessive. What's this about? Lisa stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. Mr. Bennett, we've been conducting an investigation into corporate espionage and attempted extortion. Your name has come up repeatedly, and we now have sufficient evidence to open a formal case against you." Michael laughed, though it sounded forced. "Corporate espionage? Extortion? That's a stretch, don't you think? I'm a businessman, detective, not some criminal mastermind." Lisa opened her folder, pulling out a set of documents. "These emails," she said, handing a few to Michael, "suggest otherwise. Communication with competitors, insider information traded for financial gain. And these," she handed him another set of papers, "show your direct involvement in leaking personal information about George Anderson to a tabloid, with the intent to damage both his reputation and David Roberts' business." Michael's jaw tightened as he glanced at the papers. "This is circumstantial," he said quickly, trying to maintain his composure. "It doesn't prove anything." Lisa raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "We have more than enough to proceed. Financial records, encrypted messages we've decrypted, and testimonies from individuals you've worked with." She took a step closer, her voice lowering. "I suggest you start cooperating, Mr. Bennett. It might be your only chance to make this easier on yourself." Michael's smirk faded entirely, replaced by a cold glare directed at David. "So this is your play," he said. "You couldn't handle me on your own, so you bring the cops into it?" David stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with quiet anger. "This isn't a game, Michael. You crossed every line imaginable. You didn't just come after me, you went after George, his family, and everything they've worked to build. You've been playing dirty for years, and now it's over." Michael scoffed, his tone bitter. "Don't act like you're so righteous, David. You've made your fair share of compromises. The only difference is, I don't pretend to be the good guy." David's gaze didn't waver. "You're right, I've made mistakes. But I've never destroyed someone's life to get what I wanted. You did that to George, and you've done it to countless others. It ends now." Michael threw the documents onto a nearby table, the sound echoing through the warehouse. "You think this will stop me? You think I'll just roll over because you've got some papers and a detective with you?" Lisa stepped closer, her presence commanding. "Mr. Bennett," she said evenly, "this isn't up for debate. You can either come with me voluntarily, or we can escalate this. Either way, you're leaving here in custody." Michael's bravado cracked. He looked at the papers again, his mind racing. He glanced back at David, his voice quieter but still defiant. "You'll regret this, David. You'll see." David's expression softened slightly, but there was no sympathy in his tone. "The only thing I regret, Michael, is trusting you for as long as I did." Lisa pulled out a pair of handcuffs, holding them up as she spoke. "Mr. Bennett, please turn around." Michael hesitated, his jaw tightening, before finally complying. Lisa cuffed his wrists with practiced efficiency, reading him his rights as she did so. David watched as Michael was led out of the warehouse, his steps slower now, his confidence shattered. When the door closed behind them, the silence of the empty room pressed in on him. For a long moment, David stood there alone, the weight of the confrontation settling over him. There was relief, yes, but also a profound sadness. This wasn't how he had envisioned the partnership he had once valued ending. Finally, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. When the line connected, he spoke softly. "George," he said, "it's done. Michael won't be able to hurt you or your family anymore." There was a pause on the other end before George's voice came through, quiet but resolute. "Thank you, David. I can't say this fixes everything, but it means a lot." David nodded to himself, his grip tightening on the phone. "We'll make this right, George. I promise." With Michael out of the picture, David Roberts wasted no time in taking steps to undo the damage that had been inflicted on George Anderson's reputation. He knew the battle wouldn't be easy, the article had spread widely, and the public's perception of George was already tainted. But David was determined to set the record straight. He started by reaching out to the very journalists who had published the original story. It took days of relentless calls, carefully crafted emails, and direct meetings to get their attention. Many were hesitant at first, unwilling to revisit a story they thought was already closed. But David's persistence paid off when he arrived at one meeting with a file of his own. Documents, testimonials, and personal stories that painted a fuller, more honest picture of George Anderson's life. David sat across from Leo Grayson, the editor of the Spotlight Chronicle, the tabloid that had first published the hit piece. "I have something you need to see," David began, sliding the folder across the table. Leo hesitated before opening it. "You've got a lot of nerve coming back here, Roberts," he said, flipping through the pages. That article got us the most clicks we've had all year. Why would I backtrack now? David leaned forward, his voice steady. Because you care about the truth. Or at least I hope you do. You ran a one-sided story, Leo. You took a man's darkest moments and turned them into a weapon. But there's more to George Anderson than those headlines, and you owe it to your readers to tell the full story. Leo raised an eyebrow, scanning the documents. Among them were military reports showing how George's unit had been ordered into dangerous and morally complex missions, orders he couldn't disobey without facing severe consequences. There were also personal letters from fellow soldiers, describing George as a man of integrity who had often gone out of his way to protect others, even when it put him at risk. Finally, David pulled out the most powerful piece of evidence, a photograph of a young George carrying a child out of a burning building. That child, David said, pointing to the picture, was me. George Anderson saved my life when I was 8 years old. He didn't ask for recognition or thanks. He just did what was right. That's the kind of man he is. Leo's expression softened as he studied the photograph. This is compelling, he admitted. But the public loves a scandal. A redemption arc? That's a harder sell. Then sell it, David said firmly. Show them that people are more than their worst mistakes. Show them that even heroes are human. Over the next several days, a new narrative began to emerge. Articles appeared highlighting George's acts of bravery, both in the war and beyond. Reporters interviewed soldiers who had served with him, each sharing stories of his selflessness and courage. David even arranged for a televised segment where he shared his own account of the fire and how George had risked his life to save a boy he didn't know. The tide began to turn. At home, Judy and Sarah followed every development closely. They watched as the new articles painted a more accurate picture of the man they loved. "Look at this," Sarah said one evening, showing Judy her phone. "It's an interview with one of Grandpa's old squad mates. He said Grandpa was the reason half their team made it out alive." Judy smiled, tears brimming in her eyes. "I knew he was brave," she said softly. "But seeing it like this, it makes me realize just how much he's carried all these years." When Sarah showed the articles to George, he was less enthusiastic. He read them quietly, his expression difficult to read. "Grandpa," Sarah said, sitting beside him, "people are finally seeing you for who you really are. Aren't you happy about that?" George sighed, setting the article aside. "I'm glad the truth is out," he said slowly. "But hero, that's not a word I'd use to describe myself." "You risked everything for other people, Grandpa," Sarah said, her voice firm. "That's what heroes do." George shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "Heroes don't make choices they regret for the rest of their lives." David visited George later that week, bringing a printed copy of a new feature story titled, "The Man Behind the Headlines: The True Legacy of George Anderson." "You should read this," David said, placing it on the table in front of George. George glanced at the headline, then back at David. "What's it say?" "It says you're not perfect," David replied honestly. "It says you've made mistakes. But it also says you're a man who spent his life trying to do the right thing, even when it was hard. It says you're human, George. And that's what makes your story worth telling." George nodded slowly, his eyes distant. "I appreciate everything you've done, David. But the people who were hurt, the ones I couldn't save, no article will make up for that." David sat down across from him, his gaze steady. "No, it won't. But it might help someone else see that they're not alone. That redemption is possible. That even the hardest choices don't have to define who we are forever." George didn't respond right away, but the words seemed to settle over him like a bomb. That weekend, as the wedding drew closer, Judy and Sarah began to notice subtle changes in George. He smiled a little more, laughed a little easier. He still carried the weight of his past, but there was a lightness in his step that hadn't been there before. At one point, Sarah caught him reading the new articles about himself. She didn't say anything, but the small smile on her face was enough to let him know she was proud of him. For the first time in years, George allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could begin again. The day of Sarah's wedding was one of joy and celebration, but George Anderson carried a quiet weight in his heart. He stood at the edge of the garden where the ceremony was being held, dressed impeccably in the suit David had given him. Guests milled about, their laughter and conversation blending with the soft music playing in the background. When the ceremony began, George took his place, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His eyes were fixed on Sarah as she walked down the aisle, her smile radiant. She was breathtakingly beautiful, her happiness shining so brightly that it seemed to cast away the shadows George had carried with him for so long. As she reached the altar, Sarah glanced back at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and love. George managed a small smile, but his heart ached. The past still lingered, a specter he couldn't quite banish. After the ceremony, the reception was lively and full of warmth. George found himself surrounded by family and friends, all eager to share in Sarah's happiness. Yet, despite the laughter and celebration, a part of him felt distant. Toward the end of the evening, as the crowd began to thin, George sought out David. He found him standing near the edge of the dance floor, a glass of champagne in hand, watching the guests with a thoughtful expression. "David," George said, his voice low but steady. David turned, his face lighting up with a warm smile. "George. Enjoying the night?" "It's a beautiful wedding," George replied, his tone serious. "But I need to talk to you. Privately." David's brow furrowed slightly, but he nodded. "Of course. Let's step outside." They walked together to a quiet corner of the garden, away from the noise of the reception. The moonlight cast a soft glow over the space, and for a moment, neither man spoke. "David," George began, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, "I've been carrying something for a long time. Something I need to tell you." David's expression shifted, concern flickering in his eyes. "What is it, George?" George hesitated, drawing a deep breath. "That night," he said, his voice steady but heavy, "the night of the fire. It wasn't a coincidence that I was there." David tilted his head, confusion knitting his brows. "What do you mean?" George's gaze dropped to the ground for a moment before he looked back up, meeting David's eyes. "I knew who you were. Your family. Your father. They were the target of a mission I was ordered to carry out." David's face froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. "A mission? You mean?" "I was sent there to do something I've regretted my whole life," George interrupted, his voice trembling slightly. "But when I got to your house and saw the flames, I couldn't follow through. I couldn't let those orders define me anymore." David took a step back, his mouth slightly open as he processed the revelation. "You knew my family?" "I knew enough," George said. "I knew your father had enemies, people who wanted him gone. And I was supposed to make that happen. But when I heard your cries from inside the house, everything changed. In that moment, I wasn't a soldier. I wasn't an operative. I was just a man who saw a child in danger. I didn't save you for my country or my orders. I saved you because it was the right thing to do." David was silent for a long moment, his thoughts racing. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "You disobeyed orders to save me?" George nodded, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the memory. "And it cost me everything. My career, my standing, it all crumbled after that. But I've never regretted it, David. Not for a second." David's expression softened, and he stepped closer, placing a hand on George's shoulder. "You did the right thing," he said, his voice steady. "No matter what anyone says. You made a choice to save a life, and that's what matters." George's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I've carried this secret for so long, David. I've been afraid of what you'd think if you knew the truth." David's grip on George's shoulder tightened. "What I think," he said firmly, "is that you're the man who saved my life. The man who showed me that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. And I'll never forget that." George nodded, a small genuine smile breaking through his usually stoic demeanor. "Thank you, David. That means more than you know." As the wedding came to a close and the last of the guests departed, George found himself sitting on the porch of his home, the same place where so many of his quiet nights had been spent in solitude. But tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't alone. Sarah joined him, her wedding dress now replaced with a simpler outfit. She sat beside him, her head resting gently on his shoulder. "Grandpa," she said softly, "are you happy?" George smiled, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "For the first time in a long while," he said, "I think I am." Sarah reached for his hand, holding it tightly. "I'm glad. Because to me, you've always been a hero." George chuckled quietly, shaking his head. "I'm just a man, Sarah. A man who made mistakes and tried to make up for them. And that's what makes you a hero," she said firmly. As the night deepened, David joined them, carrying 3 cups of coffee. He handed one to George and another to Sarah before taking a seat on the steps. The 3 of them sat together in comfortable silence, the weight of the past slowly lifting. For George, it wasn't about erasing his mistakes, it was about finding peace with them, about understanding that redemption wasn't a destination but a journey. For the first time in years, George felt lighter. He wasn't just the man burdened by his past. He was a grandfather, a friend, and a man who had found a way to move forward. And as he sat with the people he cared about most, George allowed himself to smile, a genuine, unburdened smile. Finally, he felt redeemed.
If you've made it this far, then subscribe to the channel and leave a comment.